we are going to continue today in our study of what it looks like to come to the table. This is the great month of Thanksgiving, and if you have already decorated for Christmas, well, that's okay, because you can be merry and thankful at the same time. I'm trying to change my own mindset, and mainly because I want to get my Christmas lights out, and I feel like if I condemn you for decorating your house and then I decorate my house, then I should deserve to be condemned. So you can be both merry and thankful. But we are looking at stories in the Bible in which Jesus uses a table or comes around a table with people and tells a greater story. And so if you remember last week, we looked at the call of Levi. And so Levi, who was a tax collector and was kind of a hated man in his community, when Christ called him, he turned his back on all of that wealth and security and everything in order to follow Jesus in obedience. And so today, we're going to look at the table in which there are two contrasting characters. But before we get to that, I'm going to tell you a story. I promised you a story every week from my family or my experiences. And so I don't think this story would play well at other churches because they don't know my family, but I think it's going to be a home run here. So when I was a kid, we would sit every night at dinner, right? And so I don't know if you know my family, but my family is loud, okay? In fact, I am maybe not anymore, but when I was growing up, I was the quietest member of my family. And that's saying something, right? If you know me and I was the quiet one, then that's a major issue, okay? So every single night, our family dinners would start out really nice, and we set the table, and the plates are out, and the forks, and the glasses, and the napkins, and then within about 5 minutes, it has descended into just loud, boisterous behavior, right? And no one is being disruptive, but in order for you to talk, you had to speak over other people. I think that's actually why I'm so loud now, because I learned how to use my diaphragm when I speak so that people would hear me, right? And so at our dining room table, I'm sure it's the same way as yours, everybody had assigned seats. And so when you would come to our dining room table, our dining room table would sit this way, right? You would walk into our dining room and the dining would spread out this way. And so my dad, he had the seat of honor at the head of the table, okay? And so Dad would sit here, and then my mother, she would sit to his left, right next to her husband. And then I would sit next to my mom, and then my younger brother, he would sit next to my dad. My older sister would sit next to him, and then all the way at this other end of the table was the youngest, little Ashton, okay? Now what that does is it creates an environment of communication that is always looking this way. And we're always broadcasting information this way because he's the one asking the questions, and your two main talkers are like right here, Levi and Jeffrey. And so this part of the table gets a lot of noise and a lot of communication. And this part of the table where Ashton and I are sitting is kind of like we're the good kids. We're the quiet kids, sorry. And so we're sitting here at the end of the table. And so I cannot tell you for the life of me what was happening in this conversation. It was loud, I can promise you that. I can't tell you what time of day it was. It might have been lunch, it might have been dinner. I can't tell you what time of year it was. I can't tell you what we were having to eat, but I can tell you exactly what happened with my younger sister. And when I asked my family what their favorite dinner time stories were, this story came up time and time and time again. And it was because it was a hilarious situation. I don't actually think it's going to tell as funny as what it was, but there is a point to this story. So we're talking, and it's loud, and we've been going at it hot and heavy for 15 or 20 minutes. Everybody's loud, everybody's talking, and then all of a sudden, I'm sitting over here, and I'm contributing, but I also hear what's happening over here. And so the conversation is happening over here, and it's chaotic, and it's loud, and all of a sudden I hear over here this repeated, I want to talk, I want to talk, I want to talk, I want to talk. And so poor little Ashton, she wasn't yelling, to her credit. She wasn't standing up and causing a scene. She just was saying over and over into her cup, I want to talk, I want to talk. And so that didn't work. And so she began to just wait because she knew there would be a lull in the conversation. And so she's still saying, I want to talk, I want to talk. But now she's got a knife and she has carved her name into the clear coat of our table. I want to talk, I want to talk. And so finally I stopped talking and I'm just kind of watching this nightmare happen over here. My mother's dining room table, and she's just carving her name into this table. So I stopped talking and I'm watching. And then all of a sudden Jeffrey stops talking and she's watching. And then my mom stops talking and she's kind of like horrified. And then my dad is looking and Levi's still talking, he's still doing his thing. And so finally he realizes, hey, nobody else is contributing. And we look over and here's Ashton. She's still, I want to talk, I want to talk. And so finally we stop. Ashton, what do you want to say? And I don't even remember what she wanted to say. I have no clue. But what I do remember that is Ashton did two things. Number one, she assessed her situation. She knew at our table everybody had a voice. And so eventually she would get to use that voice. But then number two, she kind of looked around and assessed who she was. She knew she wasn't going to overpower anybody else. So she would have the opportunity to speak, but she just had to sit in that. And so today we're going to see a story in which there are two different types of people at the table. At the Malone table, it didn't matter who you were or your age or your gender or anything like that. Well, it kind of mattered how loud you could talk, I guess. But other than that, there wasn't a reason for which one person would get to speak over the other. Everybody had a voice. And what we're going to see in this story today in Luke chapter 7 is that everyone has a voice at the table in spite of class, in spite of personality, in spite of anything else. Luke chapter 7, and we're going to start in verse 36. Luke chapter 7, verse 36. I will say, because some of y'all had horrified looks about her carving her name, she didn't get very deep. We were able to buff it out, and everybody laughs about it now, so it wasn't a big deal. It was kind of a nightmare, but it wasn't a big deal. Verse 36, it says this. Then one of the Pharisees invited him, that is Jesus, invited Jesus to eat with him. And he entered the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And a woman in the town who was a sinner found out that Jesus was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house. She brought an alabaster jar of perfume and stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began to wash his feet with her tears. And she wiped his feet with her hair, and kissing them, and anointed them with the perfume. And when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, this man, if he were a prophet, would know who and what kind of woman this is who is touching him. She is a sinner. And Jesus replied to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he said, say it, teacher. A creditor has two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And since they could not pay it back, he graciously forgave them both. So which one will love him more? And Simon answered, I suppose the one he forgave more. You have judged correctly, he told them. And turning to the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house, and you gave me no water for my feet, but she, with her tears, has washed my feet and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she hasn't stopped kissing my feet since I came in. You didn't anoint my head with olive oil, but she has anointed my feet with perfume. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. That's why she loved much. But the one who is forgiven little loves little. And then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. And those who were at the table began to say among themselves, who is this man who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So what's interesting is that this story, it takes place kind of immediately after several people trying to figure out who Jesus even is. This is relatively early in his ministry. He's been publicly doing miracles and signs, and people have seen him. And so he hasn't necessarily hidden himself from the public, but people are starting to question, okay, is this legit, or should we look for somebody else? In fact, chapter 7 starts with John the Baptist saying, "Are you the Messiah, or should we look somewhere else?" John the Baptist, if you remember, has known Jesus since his birth. John was there at the birth of Jesus. Now, he was only a few months older than Jesus, but he was there at the beginning. And John has kind of paved the way for Jesus to do this public ministry. John was the one who baptized Jesus. John was the one who told the crowds that there's one who's coming greater than me, that I can't even untie his sandals. I can't even touch his feet because he's so much greater than me. And now we're to a point where John is confused. Okay, you're not who I thought you were going to be. Are you the Messiah, or aren't you? And what Jesus says actually is he responds, well, look at the signs. The blind can see, the deaf can hear, the lame can walk, the sick have been healed, the dead have been raised. You determine for yourself if I am he. So then you've got, in chapter 7, a crowd that's kind of also assessing this situation. And they've kind of seen, some of them have believed, some of them have been healed. Some of them have received sight, some of them have received hearing. And so they see Jesus for who he is, and they believe that he's the Messiah. But you've also got a contingency in the crowd that they don't know who this guy is. We've got to continue to follow him and find out. And then finally, you've got a group of people who see Jesus and reject Jesus outright. You've got the Pharisees. The Pharisees themselves see Jesus and reject him outright. And so, in fact, I feel like in this dinner, what this Pharisee is doing is not overtly malicious, but what he's doing is trying to feel out who Jesus is. A common practice at this time would be for a traveling teacher who comes into town to sit in the synagogue and to teach. And so the local teacher, the local Pharisee, the local religious leader would invite that person to the synagogue, and then they would allow that person to speak to the Jews that were in that town. In fact, this is taking place in Capernaum, and if you go to Capernaum today, you can see a teacher's seat where more than likely Jesus sat to do this very thing. It still exists. It's a stone seat with Hebrew inscriptions all around it, speaking about instruction of God's people and stuff like that. And so the very seat where Jesus would have sat, not at this meal, but at the synagogue, still exists today. You can still see it. And so common practice was this traveling teacher would come in and teach at the synagogue, and then the Pharisee would receive him, or the religious leader would receive him into his house, right? And so I don't think that there's anything overtly malicious that's happening here, but there's definitely some things that are being thrown to the wayside, right? You see all of these kind of in verses 44 and following, but if you had an honored guest who were come to your house, or if you had someone that you respected and that you were going to show respect, there were several things that you would do for that person to show them honor, to show them respect. You would wash their feet. Your primary mode of transportation at this time is your feet. And they don't have asphalt roads, they have dirt paths. And so your feet would get very dirty, and common courtesy, because we're laying down to eat dinner and our feet are going to kind of be out and about. Common courtesy is as you come in, there's a bowl of water, and kind of the person with the lowest status in the house would wash your feet. So if I've got several slaves, then the worst slave or worst servant would be the one washing my feet. Potentially, if I've got several children, the youngest child, the one without the least amount of status, right, is going to be washing our feet. And so that's the first thing that kind of anybody would do. You would wash your guests' feet. The second thing that you would do is, and Paul actually says this a lot, greet one another with a holy kiss. So on our way out today, we're going to greet one another with a holy kiss. As we leave today, I'm going to tell you just to find your neighbor and greet them with a holy kiss. Now, what you would do is you would see a brother, or you probably wouldn't man and woman kiss, but man to man or woman to woman, brother and sister, brother and sister Jew is what I'm saying, not in Christ, because at that time they weren't. But you would see him and you would give him like a kiss on the cheek and kind of just a blessing, like how are you doing? It's good to see you, right? And so if you're going to honor someone who's coming to your house for a meal, then you would give them that kiss on the cheek, kind of a welcome to my house, thank you for coming. And then the final thing that you would do is that you would kind of just take a bit of olive oil and just anoint their head with oil, kind of as a blessing. Olive oil at the time, one of the main exports of Israel, even now, is olives. And so you can go to Israel now, and if you look out, I've got a lot of really gorgeous pictures of looking out over the valley of Megiddo, which is, in Greek, is called Armageddon. But the valley of Megiddo is filled with all sorts of vegetation. And among those, many of those plants that you see are olive plants. There's olives everywhere. The soil is really, really good for olives in Israel. And so it's incredibly cheap to get olive oil in Israel. And so this guy would not have had to spend any amount of money on olive oil. You would just do that as common courtesy. I'm going to bless you with this olive oil, and then we're going to go about our meal. Three things could happen in order for you to bless a guest, and this guy didn't do any of them. Now, I don't think he's being malicious, but he's definitely not going out of his way to be kind. He's kind of trying to feel him out. And so in the story, because I think the point of this story, I think what Jesus is doing, I think what the gospel writer Luke is doing, is he wants you to look at these two characters and compare and contrast them to see what it is to follow Jesus, or what it is to be considered right in God's eyes, right? So the first guy you've got is the Pharisee. The first character we see is the Pharisee, and the Pharisee invites Jesus over to his house. Now, to be a Pharisee kind of meant a lot of good things for a person. Pharisees had status. They had legal authority. They were respected teachers. They were more educated than their peers. In fact, Pharisees were experts in the Old Testament, because what would happen is every Jewish male from 4 or 5 until they were 12 would go to a school, and they would learn the Torah. And so when you turned 12 years old, Jewish males, in order to become a man at their bar mitzvah, would quote through the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So a teacher would just say, okay, start at here, and he would begin quoting a line. God said to Moses, go to my people and tell them that I sent you. And then the boy would just pick up the narrative and begin and continue reciting until the teacher said stop. And so that was, if I wanted to become a man, any boy, I had to do that. The Pharisees were the cream of the crop. They were the best of the best. You had to be picked to be a Pharisee. So every boy has the ability to do that, and then at 12, a teacher would come along and handpick 3 or 4 followers to follow him at his feet and learn from his feet. These were the best of the best. They were the smartest. They were the most apt. These were the GT kids, right? These were the ones that you expect are going to go far in life. And so being a Pharisee was a really good thing in town. He had a lot of status. He had a lot of power. He had a lot of authority. People listened to him. That's your first character, is the Pharisee. Now, the second character, we don't know anything about her. We don't know her name. We don't know her job. And in fact, the only thing that Luke tells us about her is, he says, verse 37, and a woman in the town who was a sinner. That's his description of her. That's not the Pharisees' thought. The Pharisee might have thought a lot of people were sinners. The gospel writer Luke says, a woman in the town who was a sinner found Jesus. That's all that she's got going for her. She has no power. She has no authority. She has no status. She has no name. She is a woman from Capernaum who was a sinner. And in fact, her reputation kind of preceded her. Everyone in town knew she was a sinner. Luke knew that she was a sinner. And so the only thing that he thought as a relevant detail about her was that she was a sinner. These are the two people we have to compare and contrast. Someone with power and status and money in a house, and a woman from Capernaum who was a sinner. And so the night unfolds, and the Pharisee begins eating and dining with Jesus. And oftentimes what would happen is if you had a visiting rabbi in town, the doors would remain open, the windows would remain open, and the city would kind of just come to the house to listen to the debate. Maybe my teacher is going to ask him about what he thinks about divorce, and then we're going to have a big debate about that. Or maybe my teacher is going to ask him a specific interpretation of Isaiah, and then he's going to give a response. And so it kind of was like a lecture circuit. So anybody in town could come, and they could open the windows and just sit by the window and listen to the lively debate happening. This is Friday night in Capernaum. This is the entertainment, okay? And so this woman, she appears at the meal, and this isn't necessarily outside of the norm, but the Pharisee clocks her. He notices who she is. And more than that, when she begins to weep at Jesus' feet, when she begins to wash Jesus' feet, when she begins to anoint Jesus' feet, the Pharisee says to himself, not aloud, to himself, well, that does it right there. That proves it. This guy can't be a prophet, because a prophet would know who it is that's touching his feet. This guy's no prophet. He doesn't know that this woman's a sinner. He doesn't know that he's being defiled right now, that his cleanliness before Yahweh is being defiled. He has no clue. This guy's not a prophet. He can't be. And so that's what he's thinking in his mind. There's no way this guy is who he says he is. Which I think is funny, because Jesus responds not to his verbal statement, but to his mental thought. And he says this. He says, Simon, I have something to say to you. And Simon doesn't even consider him as anymore. He just says, oh, say it, teacher. This isn't some sort of, I'm going to respect you now. This is a kind of a plithy, say it. Whatever. Say it, teacher. And Jesus goes into this parable. He says, a creditor has two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And since they couldn't pay it back, he graciously forgave them both. So which one will love him more? And Simon answered, I suppose the one he forgave more. Seems like a silly story. I suppose it's the one that he would have forgiven more. But what I find interesting about that story is that the story itself, both people owed a debt. And both people were unable to repay that debt. Now the debts were greater. One was 500 denarii. That's basically 2 years worth of debt. I owe you 2 years worth of work in order to even get close to paying this off. Without interest, without anything else, 2 years of hard work in order to pay that off. The other guy just owed maybe a month and a half worth of debt. Well, if I just work hard, it's going to be unpleasant. But if I work hard for a month and a half, then perhaps I can work this debt off. But what Jesus says is that both of them were unable to pay their debt. Both of them. They're both debtors. And the creditor, for some unknown reason, looks at both of them and decides to forgive them. I see that you can't pay this back, And so your debt's erased. It doesn't exist. It's gone. And then Jesus says, now which one do you think would love him more? To which Simon responds, well, I guess the one that had the greater debt. And this is what I think is so interesting about this story. He tells him this story. Simon doesn't yet know that Jesus heard his thought or knows his thought. He doesn't say it aloud to the group. He's thinking to himself. He says to himself, this guy can't be a prophet. But what Jesus says is, you have judged correctly. And turning to the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? That's Simon's problem. I think there's 4 things we can see in this text, actually, that compare and contrast the Pharisee and the woman. But the first thing that we see is Simon doesn't see the woman. Simon, all he's doing is testing out Jesus. He sees the woman for her sin, but he doesn't see her for who she is. He sees her based on her reputation. See, the Pharisee was testing Jesus out, but the woman was overwhelmed by Jesus' grace. Simon, in an attempt to identify who Jesus is, invites him to his house, but doesn't even show him the common courtesy of washing his feet. And yet the woman, with her tears, begins washing his feet with her own tears. When Jesus failed the test of a prophet's knowledge, Simon kept that to himself. He wasn't concerned anymore with learning about who Jesus was or showing him honor. He was concerned with how Jesus could fit and now won't fit in his own lifestyle. Simon is looking to potentially add Jesus to his already established religious ideology, whereas the woman is overwhelmed by who Jesus is, by his love. She's not trying to fit Jesus into her box. What she's trying to do is create an entirely new understanding of who he is. And so these two are contrasting one another. The woman was overcome with emotion. She saw the grace that Jesus showed to someone like her, and she was moved with emotion to the point of weeping. The woman was aware of her sin. Simon, he was secure in his works. For Simon, he was very aware of who the woman was. Simon was aware of her sin, but Simon was also secure in himself. Hey, I'm not her, right? I keep the law. I do the things that God has commanded us to do. I don't have any sin in my life. If people would just be like me rather than like her, then the world would be a better place. If people just thought like me, then rather like her, then the world would be a better place. If people just agreed with me or did what I do, then the world would be a better place. He wasn't aware of his own need. He was aware of her sin, but he wasn't aware of any sin in his own life. Whereas the woman, she was overwhelmed with her sin. She was overwhelmed with her sin to the point of tears. He says, turning to the woman, he says, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house, and you gave me no water for my feet. But she with her tears has washed my feet and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she hasn't stopped kissing my feet since I came in." For Simon, Jesus was something that he could add or discard at will. It wasn't something necessary to his life. And with the woman, she was so overwhelmed that the only thing that she could do was weep, wash his feet with her tears. So the Pharisee was testing out Jesus. The Pharisee was secure in his works. And the Pharisee gave nothing to Jesus. But the woman gave everything she had. Quite intentionally, the Pharisee chose not to show Jesus even the most common of courtesies. It would have cost him nothing to have a bowl of water for Jesus' feet. And yet he chooses not to do it. It would have cost him literally nothing to give him a kiss on the cheek as a sign of respect or honor or welcome. It would have cost him very, very, very little to give him just one dab of olive oil, because olive oil was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. And yet we see this story, a similar story to this in John, where it says that Mary brought a jar of perfume similar to this. And in John's gospel, he gives us an amount of what the perfume would have cost. And in John's gospel, it would have cost 300 denarii, 300 days' work. It would have cost a year's worth of work for this jar of perfume. And so we can probably safely assume that this jar of perfume that this sinful woman brought was a similar cost. It might have been the most precious thing that she owned. In fact, oftentimes when a father was going to prepare for his daughter to be married, he would come up with some sort of fee that he could give to a husband. If I'm going to be able to marry my daughter off, and I want to arrange this marriage with someone that's profitable, I need to have something to give to the husband or give to the family in order to sell my daughter to them, so that then they begin to take care. And so this jar of perfume very well could have been the most expensive thing that she owned in her life. And yet she brought it, and after cleaning Jesus' feet, anoints those feet with her most precious possession. It cost the Pharisee nothing to evaluate Jesus, but it cost the woman everything. And then finally, we see that the Pharisee was focused on the woman's reputation, and the woman was focused only on Jesus. Considering the woman, the Pharisee never sees her, but he sees her shortcomings. His entire focus on the evening shifts when the woman enters the room. We notice that he sees her. We notice that in his own mind, he begins talking to himself about what's taking place. Well, this answers it. Surely he's not a prophet. If a prophet knew what kind of woman this was, he would know. And he doesn't know. See, the Pharisee is only focused on the woman's sin. He's not focused on Jesus. And yet the woman is so aware of her sin that she is only focused on Jesus. That she is focused on nothing and no one else but Jesus. It says that she let down her hair and dried his feet. You gave me no water from my feet, but she with her tears has washed my feet and wiped them with her hair. That's a very significant cultural thing that she does. What this woman does is she lets down her hair completely. When a woman would become of the age that she could be married, when she could basically at her I can't remember what the girl version of it is, bar mitzvah for a girl, when she would get to that age, she would come out publicly and have her hair up. And never again would anyone publicly see her with her hair down. That was reserved exclusively for her husband or for her family. It was an intimate kind of thing. It almost would have been considered an immoral thing for her to have her hair down. And yet for Jesus, she's not focused on anybody else in the room. She's not focused on anybody else understanding who she is. What she does is she lets her hair down and wipes Jesus' feet off with the thing that she has available, which is her hair. She's not worried about her reputation. She's not worried about what people would think about her. What she does is she is completely and utterly infatuated with who Jesus is and what that he has done for her life, that she lets her hair down. While the Pharisee is completely obsessed with who she is, with what her reputation is, she is solely focused on Jesus. And so in verse 47, Jesus makes this statement, "Therefore I tell you, though her sins are many, they have been forgiven, and that is why she loved much." I think often this is what we've got to consider. I think much like my little sister here who knew that she had a voice at the table and a seat at the table, what I want us to consider today is that everyone has a seat at the table. There's not a thing that you've got to do to earn a seat at God's table. In fact, quite the opposite. According to the parable, and according to Romans, and according to Hebrews, and according to Scripture after Scripture after Scripture, we are debtors who cannot pay our debt. And so whether my debt is 5 days worth of hard labor or 500 days of labor, I can't pay it back. And yet I don't have to, because everyone has a seat at the table. I think oftentimes we fall into this same trap that the Pharisee did. How do you look at Jesus? Are you testing him out to see if he's going to fit with your lifestyle? Are you trying to add a little bit of Jesus and go about the rest of your day? Carl's giving out little Jesuses. I like that. Everybody needs a little Jesus. It's an opening to share the gospel and evangelism. But I think sometimes people try to take that little Jesus, and I'm going to add that to my collection of other things. I need a little bit of Jesus, and I need a little bit of science, and I need a little bit of history, and I need a little bit of naturalism. And if I can just get all of these things right, then I'll finally have my life right. A little bit of hedonism, because I want to have a little bit of fun, right? And so what the Pharisee is doing is he's trying to assess who Jesus is and how he fits in my life. And I think the person that we're supposed to emulate this is not the man of status, but the sinful woman. That when she looks at Jesus, she doesn't try to add him to her lifestyle. Jesus becomes her sole focus. In her life, Jesus is her lifestyle. How do you look at Jesus? I think the second thing that we've got to understand is, how do you look at yourself? For the Pharisee, I think he looks at this and he says, well, at least I'm not her. You know, I could be a lot worse than I am. I don't drink, I don't smoke, and I don't run with girls who do, right? That's the good old phrase we use. And yet what we've got to understand is we need to look at ourselves and see the truth. The Bible says in Isaiah that we all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own ways, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The Bible's very clear about our status, but we don't have to be overwhelmed. We don't have to hate ourselves because of our state. Nobody knows our sin more than we do. Nobody knew that woman's sin more than she did. And yet she saw that Jesus, in his love and his grace, accepted her for who she was. She didn't have to clean her life up first before she came to him. She didn't have to bring anything. She didn't have to present anything. She just had to come to Jesus and lay at his feet. And I think a lot of times when we look at ourselves, if we don't look at ourselves in our right state before God, then we get it all twisted around. In my small group, we're looking at the book of Job. And Job says time and time again, I didn't do anything to deserve this. I didn't do anything. And his friends are all giving him terrible advice. You must have done something terrible in order for God to hurt you like this. And so finally says, you know what? I'm justified before God. I have done everything right. And then God says, hold up, brother. Where were you when I set the foundations? Where were you when I placed the stars in the sky? And I think we need to understand who we are in relation to God. David says in Psalms, who am I that you are mindful of me, that you hear me when I call? David, very aware of his sin, very aware of his failings. And yet, who am I that the creator of the universe is mindful? I've got to come to the table with humility. I've got to understand who I am. How do you think about yourself? What have you given to Jesus? I asked this question last week. Are you holding back parts of your life from Jesus? God, I'm going to give you 98%, but don't touch my work. I'm going to give you 98%, but don't touch my money. I need that. I'm going to give you 98%, but don't touch my family. How is it that what are you giving to God? Are you giving him everything? Do you trust him with everything? I think the other thing that I see in this passage is that the woman is overwhelmed in her security with who God is and what he's going to do. She gives him her most valuable asset, without thinking about how am I going to eat tomorrow? What am I going to do? Well, I needed that nest egg because I wanted to have a vacation home in Tahiti. Like, that is not her mindset. She trusts God with everything. How are you in the trusting God department? Are you trusting Him financially? Are you giving to God what He is owed? Are you trusting God physically with your health and with your family's health? What is it? What are you giving to God? Is it costing you anything? What have you given to Jesus? And then finally, what are you focused on today? I think as Christians, and I think as Christians who have just come through an election, a lot of times we're focused on the enemy. We're better than them. We're not voting this way because they believe this and this and this. We're not, doing this, we're not doing that. And I think so often we get focused on other people that we forget to focus on ourselves. I'm better than them. I'm not doing what they're doing. And yet Jesus says that we all can't pay that debt. That we all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned our own way, and yet the Lord laid on Him the iniquity of us all. That Jesus bore our sin. It's not that we are doing good things and they're doing bad things. We need to be focused on ourselves. Who are we focused on? We're focused on our problem and the forgiveness that Jesus gives us. The grace that Jesus gives us. I close today by reminding you of theologian Ashton, that everyone has a seat at the table. That you know your place, you know your position, you trust that you will have an opportunity to speak. That you don't have to be a big kid to speak, that you don't have to have a loud voice, but that everyone has a seat at the table. When we come to the table, when we look at the table in Scripture, when we look at this idea of what it means to come to Christ and to His family, there's no one with status that is required. That everyone has the opportunity to come to the table equally. That we come as debtors who have been forgiven. As people who owe a debt that we cannot pay back to ones who have received forgiveness.